Hey everybody, it's Uncle John from Your Story Hour, and I'm here to bring you chapter number 7 from Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo, and Still Mo by author Sam Campbell. Chapter 7 is entitled, Just Make Yourself at Home. The red squirrel, or chicory, would never draw praise for his disposition. He is the sauciest scamp in the whole forest. He makes everyone, man, bird, or beast, feel totally unwelcome in the region which he considers his home. With his own fellows, he is extremely belligerent much of the time. You have never had a genuine bawling out until you have encroached on the domain of a red squirrel and he turns loose on you. Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo, and Still Mo had all the characteristics of their kind. They confirmed all the things we had believed about red squirrels and taught us more. We have never worked with creatures who wanted less babying. They had brief babyhood, almost no childhood. Giny and I would shiver with concern when we watched the little rascals, not much larger than deer mice except for their tails, racing about the treetops at dizzying heights. From the time the squints left the cage, they began carving out little individual niches on our island's world. There was much squabbling among them. Their differences, like our political issue, were worked out through great oratory, argument, and plain bantering. They chased one another about, screamed uncomplimentary things, made long speeches from treetops, and sometimes bit and scratched. But in the end, they had accomplished very definite understandings, and I guess if that is the way they must work out their problems, we should be content not to criticize. When someone speaks of the noisy red squirrel squabbles in the forest, I wonder just how a political convention would sound to a squirrel. Maybe it is just as well we don't know what they say to one another. But likewise, it is well for our reputation that we do not understand that they do not understand. But likewise, it is well for our reputation that they do not understand our language when we are in controversy. After a few days of this wild squabbling by the squints, Giny and I realized that there was a very tangible result, a definite accomplishment. They had divided our island into 5 sections, and each squirrel had an area of his own. The cabin vicinity was sort of neutral territory. The feeding station was there, and it was no man's land. But the living areas belonged definitely to certain individuals. Eeny had taken over the most eastern portion of the island where our campfire parties were held. Her home was the great old scrub oak near our campfire site. The oak had a homey appearance, and I could understand why Eeny selected it. It looked strong and permanent. Its branches were substantial. When we were choosing an area on the island for our campfires, this one had been selected because of the old oak. It seemed firm, friendly, companionable, and we wanted to be near it. At a crotch in the old tree, Eeny found a little hollow and ready-made home. She enlarged the opening, did some house cleaning, and moved in, obviously very happy in this sylvan mansion. On the south side of the oak, one long limb reached far out beyond the others so that it was in full sunlight much of the day. Here Eeny loved to spend lazy hours. She was so tiny it was hard to see her 25 feet from the ground, but often we would discover her lying full length on this favorite limb, perfectly relaxed, while the warm sun poured its salubrious rays over her. Near at hand were 2 towering white pines and many smaller balsams, cedars, and white birches. On the ground, near where wintergreen plants and bearberries offering promise of food in the near future. Eeny was so devoted to her oak home that she seldom encroached on the territory of the others. Mo had settled on the north of our cabin. It was easiest there. He would be so close to the feeding station he had a hollow white tree to live in and 2 old stumps with exposed roots where he could store things. He didn't bother the other squirrels often. It was just too much trouble. Mo spent much of his time yawning. He always looked lazy. When we tapped on his tree and called him to come down and get a peanut, it would take him so long we disliked to wait. Sometimes he would come part way down the tree, then pause a few feet from my head as if to say, "What's the hurry?" He would hang on to the bark with his hind feet and stretch hard with his front ones, while he indulged in an immoderate yawn. Miney had wisely chosen a little hillside just back of our kitchen door. Here was a dense thicket of balsam trees, some birches and maples. I never located his living quarters. They may have been under the house, for he was there a great deal. In fact, that was one of the advantages of his hillside location. He could pass under the house to the feeding station. Miney, no doubt, got more than his share of everything. Meeny settled on the northwest corner of the island. From there, this troublemaker and born teaser made raids continuously on all other squirrel countries. We would hear frantic cries from Miney and look out to see Meeny out on a pestering rampage. Next, there would be a wild outburst from Mo, and there would go old Meeny racing right through his property. Perhaps 3 minutes later, Eeny would start chattering like an electric riveter, and that prize pest would be down there. It is easy to imagine things when you are watching animals, and no doubt we did in the early days with the squirrels. But certainly it seemed that Meeny made his raids on the other territories just to get a rise out of his sister and brothers. One place he learned to avoid: the land of stubby-tailed Stillmo. The little high-spirited adventurer had the largest territory of all. He had selected the tree-covered ridge at the southwest corner of the island, including the boathouse. Stillmo needed much living room. His incessant activity demanded space and variety. Meeny ventured down into Stillmo's country several times, but soon learned better. Stillmo gave him a chasing he didn't forget. An international agreement was reached between them almost immediately. In plain language, it was that Meeny was to stay away from Stillmo's land and mind his own business, or else. Meeny argued against this arrangement for just a few moments. He and Stillmo crouched facing each other about a foot apart on a log, each yelling at the top of his voice. Argument proving futile, there was a brief, sudden battle. The two of them locked in a scratching, screaming, kicking bundle of red fur. Then the clinch broke, and Meeny made a dash for freedom, the victorious Stillmo pursuing him up and down trees, through the foliage, around stumps, over the boathouse, and across the borderline into his own territory. There Stillmo paused, mounted high in a hemlock, and in his harsh voice announced to the world that the same thing would happen to any so-and-so chickaree who dared invade his domain. Meeny chattered back brave-sounding statements, but he stayed at a distance. After that, there was little trouble between them, except for frontier skirmishes. But while Stillmo was apparently the master of the squints, he was not a bully. He loved his own land and seldom ventured out of it except to visit the feeding station. In spirit, he was much like Duke. He was having a good time being alive. Sometimes other squirrels were with him, obviously just to play. They would race after one another, but in the best of humor, their manners having no resemblance to the heated arguments prevalent when territorial boundaries were being decided. But Stillmo, the philosopher, the adventurer, the individualist, could be happy alone. We saw him having the grandest times with none but himself in his little world. Red squirrels are amazing in their way of racing through the foliage, but Stillmo was the most expert performer at these gymnastics that I have ever seen. I traced his route through the trees one day and made notes of his startling athletic display. He was sitting perfectly quiet on a stump when some plan originating in his mind suddenly animated him. With several little sharp chirps, which might have been the red squirrel words for whoopee, he jumped down and raced across the ground toward a large hemlock tree. His little legs moved so fast it was hard to see them, and his stubby tail was held aloft as if it were a banner. Up the hemlock he went at a pace fully equal to that on the ground. At a point about 50 feet high, he reached a long limb which apparently fitted his specifications. Without a moment's hesitation, he ran its length, leaped 8 feet through the air, and caught hold of the tiny twigs at the end of a birch branch. I gasped. "Stillmo, don't do that," I called, just wasting my breath. "Sissy," he chattered down at me, and away he went. His route led him through the birch, over another startling leap to a balsam, then to a young maple, and on into a Juneberry tree. Here he faced a problem. The next tree in line of flight was a hemlock, and there was quite a gap. His problem was complicated by the fact that the limb from which he must make his jump and the one to where he had to land were both small and unsteady. He wasn't sure about the matter. 3 times he ran the length of the takeoff branch in the Juneberry tree to survey the leap before him. To me, it looked impossible. Not so to Stillmo. He ran to the end of the Juneberry limb once more, stood poised for an instant, and then shot through the air with such ease it seemed the tree had tossed him. Only his front feet touched the tiny twigs on the awaiting hemlock, but that was enough for him. His little fingers clutched and held, and he climbed into the foliage. Without waiting to rest, he ran on, his route now an easy one. The trees, for some distance, had their foliage interlaced, and he simply ran from one to the other. He ended his wild flight 150 feet from where he started by making a sensational leap to the ground and racing under our house. The little fella had gone through 23 trees of varying sizes during this run, and he had made 4 leaps of 6 feet or over. If ever you want to lose any conceit you may have over athletic ability, just observe the flight of a red squirrel. One day, Jenny and I watched Stillmo in a little stunt that was almost too cute. The play took place at an old stump, and at first we thought all 5 squints were there. We saw a squirrel at the top of the stump, and then he disappeared, and there was one at the bottom almost instantly. Now there was one at the side. Now there was one at the other side, and at the top again, and now at the bottom again. As we drew closer, we saw what was going on. This was a hollow stump, and Stillmo had carved it into a playground. He had tunnels all through the decayed wood and a number of entrances and exits made at the top and the sides and among the old roots. Apparently, he was trying to be in a number of places at one time and succeeded in giving the impression that he could do it. He would poke his little head out the top, disappear, and quick as a snap of the finger, appear at the bottom. He was having a wonderful time in this little game he had invented for himself. Sometimes he would run away from the stump a few feet, only to make a dash for it, disappear into the roots, and seemingly at the same instant peek out of the top. For days, Stillmo played about this old stump. Occasionally one of the other squirrels came visiting and joined him in the game, but he was content to carry on alone. So our little 2-acre island was converted into a federation of red squirrel communities, and it is probable that in all the history of our forest never had there been so much chattering and scolding by chickarees in so small an area in so short a time. And that is the end of Chapter 7. Tomorrow, Aunt Nikki is going to bring to you Chapter 8, which is entitled Care of Postmaster San Francisco. Sounds like there's a letter, maybe from Duke. See you tomorrow.